Hello and welcome to the Things We Know. This is Kari.
And I'm Lisa. And today we decided to do another bonus pod because we did the bonus pod for Mother's Day. And so we have to and want to do a bonus pod dedicated to our dads and also our husbands who are our fathers. No, our children's father. That's the word I'm
Yes.
looking for. Our father's
Yes.
children.
Yeah. And just to celebrate all the ways dads bring love and humor and support and stability to our lives. Yeah. So, but we really want to start before we get to our our kids' dads. We want to start with our own dads. So let's start with them and what we admire about the way they took on their roles as fathers. You want to start with yours?
Yeah, sure. So my dad's name is Joseph William Bishop, which I actually named Liam Joseph after my dad. The irony is I didn't realize that Liam was short for William until he was born. So had I known, I probably would have made him William Joseph. So it was the opposite of my dad. But then he would have run the risk of being called Bill, and he really is a Liam, which is actually, it's funny because my dad is actually, his family called him Bill because there was an Uncle Joe. So I knew him as Joe, but when we were around his family, he was Bill. Like my cousins call him Uncle Bill and so forth. So it's funny how names evolve. What did I love and admire about my dad? I mean, my dad was 9 years older than my mom. So that was interesting. So he was 30 when they got married, and my mom was he was 29 and my mom was 20. So he was 30 when I was born. And that was unusual back then to have that sort of age difference and so forth. My family would probably joke they never thought my dad would get married. When my parents got divorced, he never dated. He never had another relationship. So my dad was very much sort of a loner. I'm pretty sure he had OCD, and I do say that with love. So there's just funny things I remember about my dad. I think one of the things I admire most about him is I'm going to say his generosity, which is controversial a little bit probably in my family, because I didn't grow up thinking he was that way. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, so my dad kind of controlled all the money. And so just, that sort of generation, there was this probably a bit of a struggle around my mom being given money, versus earning her own and that sort of thing. But the thing that always strikes me is that when my parents got divorced, first off, he didn't argue anything. Like, it was a very amicable divorce. And so even though they were divorced, we spent all of our holidays together. My mom and dad actually had a pretty good relationship.
That is awesome.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, and it was definitely a model for how my relationships went and staying, friends and close to people. And I'm seeing that happen with Charlotte as well, and Liam. So I still got, even though they were divorced, I got to spend a lot of time with him. And then when I turned 18, he no longer had to pay child support. So he asked me to move in with him to help my mom, which I thought was really cool. And I remember that back then. We only lived about a mile up the road from where my mom and my sister lived. But it was interesting because I got to then, I'd lived with my mom since I was in the 7th grade. And then my college years, and until I moved out, I lived with him. And so I remember thinking that was really kind-hearted, even back at the time. He definitely gave me my love of exercise because he was big into physical fitness. We talked about this a little bit in the diet culture one. So there was a double-edged sword in some ways, because it was sort of his wanting us to look a certain way. But I'm so glad, because for me, exercise is about my mental health. So I'm grateful that he instilled that sort of love in me. So yeah, his generosity, his love of movement. And I will say, I do think, along with my mom, we talked about this in the Music and Laughter is Medicine, he absolutely instilled music and love of music,
Nice.
rock and roll in particular. My mom was more the pop bent. So those are the things I think about when I think about my dad.
Oh, I still love that your dad said, "I'll take you to the Go-Go's if you score a goal." And he was like, "Oh, shoot," when you did. That's so good.
That memory is burned into my brain. I love it so much.
Oh, that is so lovely. What was like, how would you describe your bond?
Yeah, it was close. So it's interesting because growing up, I was very much told all my life that I looked like my mom and my sister looked like my dad. Now, as I've gotten older, I actually think I kind of look more like my dad than my mom. I definitely have my dad's body, his legs and torso sort of square. And we'll put a picture up because one of my favorite pictures is me and my dad standing on the beach in Tampa, and we're literally standing exactly the same way. And I'm like 4, and he's probably like 34. And we're both just standing on the beach.
So cute.
So there was this separation in some ways of like, oh, you look like your mom, but personality wise, I think I'm very much like my dad. And so we did have sort of the same sense of humor, same anger issues, I want to say, except his wasn't as mitigated. Like I know how to handle, my dad would fly off the handle not at us, not at the kids, but like customer service. If it wasn't good, like, oh man, he'd go from 0 to 60 in a hot minute. And I'd be like, Dad, that's not helpful. But there's a lot of us personality wise that I think is much more similar than I am, or I was, to my mom. And the same, probably, I think my sister would say the same thing. She was always told she was like my dad, but she's really a lot more like my mom. But my dad was very supportive of Amy and I. Amy went down a path of like being a cheerleader and just really involved in high school. And as we said in the music pod, I started going to see bands when I was 16 at bars, and he would often take me to those.
Wow.
And so, he would go see my boyfriend's bands play, and then he'd also go and see Amy cheer at a football game, so he was supportive of whatever we were supportive of, or whatever we were into. So that's what I think of when I think. And again, we started exercising together when I was probably in the 7th or 8th grade. So that was a big piece of it. We went to a running class, whatever that means.
So nice.
Yeah. So that's what I think about when I think about my bond. Yeah. What about you?
Oh, yeah. It's funny when you just said the thing about customer service. I think that's not uncommon for a lot of people to just cringe when their parents are like, "Can I speak to the manager?"
Yeah.
Like, oh,
oh no.
We had some moments like that. My dad was a young dad. So James is, I'm gonna see if my mom got back to me. Hold on. Nope. If she does, I will come back. But James Joseph Morin, but they're French Canadian, and my grandfather was Joseph Napoleon Aloysius Charles Louis or something. Like he had all these middle names, and I'm pretty sure my dad has a lot of those too. So okay. Napoleon is in there, which is so great.
So
but James Joseph went by Jim or Jimmy when he was growing up. He was a fighter pilot, so he also went by JJ. And it's so hard to just describe my dad in one little bit, because he was just larger than life to us, he was this young dad. The only boy, had 4 sisters and grew up in Rochester, New York, and had a paper route and was supporting himself in 8th grade. And I think he had a fake ID by the time he was in high school, and the drinking age was 18. Right. So he just kind of did his own thing. He was really responsible. He got good grades. He was, my mom, they were friends in high school. Like he was in the plays. When he would dance, apparently people would form a circle around him. Like he was always just, in fact, I was going to mention that, like the way he dances is one of my favorite things. He's a great dancer, just kind of big personality and very passionate person. So when he became a dad at 21, he, with my brother, I think he thought like discipline, also the military probably, and the Catholic lent to that. Like if I'm really hard on him, the other ones will fall in line. So he was incredibly tough. He expected a lot of us. He always expected good behavior, and he was very into being respected. Not really bad things. I mean, these are really good things he instilled, but we were like a little bit afraid sometimes because he did have a temper, but honestly, he was a pretty happy person, and he loved flying. Whether he was in the reserves flying or he became an airline pilot and a flight instructor. I picture my dad coming in his flight shirt with the wings on it and his flight hat with the biggest smile, like happy to be home, happy to see us, but also happy going to work. Like he absolutely loved what he did. And that's pretty neat. I love that legacy. And so he was just a passionate guy. He loved music, absolutely loved music. We didn't always love his music, but we loved some of it. But he would just put it on and just be, oh, and, like have a glass of wine and just like he got really into opera at one point too. And, like he'll get into stuff and really like, oh, you got to listen to this and turn up the volume. And just, anything he was excited about, it was hard not to get excited about it with him. The other thing I always think about him is, I don't know how he did it. He didn't miss anything. Like he was a pilot.
Yeah.
And we would all be in soccer games on different fields on a Saturday. And I guarantee like right when I would think he's not going to make it. And I'd be running down the field and I hear, you're faster than you think you are, Bear. That's what he called me, Bear, or Kari Bear. You're faster than you think you are. He'd make it to at least half of each of our games.
That's amazing.
He made it to everything. When he was in town, he I don't think this was right away. It was a different era. I think my mom did a lot on her own. Sure. But at some point he really did evolve into like when he was not flying, he was vacuuming, he was driving carpool, he was shopping. He was doing, he never really cooked. We have some funny stories about him melting things in the microwave, but he really, really, tried to be around for stuff. And it's funny though, because when he was home, it was family time, right? And there was a certain decorum we had. So when he wasn't around, I think my sisters and my brother and we would misbehave at the table and do silly stuff. And I remember my mom going, "You would not do this if your dad was here." Like we'd, stick carrots up our nose. We had a very, like nobody, you're not on the phone. You don't pick up the phone. He was so annoyed by the phone. I felt so sorry for whoever didn't know they were calling during dinner. And he would be like, "Do you know we're eating dinner?" Yeah. Walk over to the phone that's on the wall. Cause it was back then. But, so we had like this certain, this certain behavior. And then when he was gone, my poor mom, she demanded respect too, but I think sometimes she probably felt we saved our best behavior for him. But at some point we would have sleepovers only when he was gone. And people were like, "Do you have a dad?" So he got the message on that. And it was pretty funny. I remember some slumber parties where he was just out in the pool with, either my sister and her friends or me and my friends and like, just launching people off his shoulders or coming out and doing like a little impersonation of something. And I remember Flip Wilson was one of them or something, but he just used to, like he would respond to those things. So he was pretty good and responsive to that. Loved my mom so much. So yeah, I think, over time, he was just that passion thing, the discipline. I think over time, what I noticed was a lot of like the ability to like think clearly and have that 30-foot view, which is probably what a pilot needs, right?
Sure.
But where he was different than my mom, that I wanted to mention is the parenting thing that I always want to emulate. There was two things he did. Because he could fly off the handle. He did have a temper, but he never did about the big stuff. And with teenagers, he was kind of brilliant. A couple of things. He would be like, "Here's a dime." You're that old. Here's a dime. All it took was a dime and a payphone. And he'd say, "Put it in your pocket. No questions asked if you have to use this. You will not be in trouble. Like do not get in a car with someone who's drinking."
Yeah.
And that was kind of big for him since his generation didn't really have a care about that, but he was really aware of our safety. The other thing he would do, and you'd say, "Hey Dad, can I borrow this? Or, can I use this? Or can I go to this thing?" "Well, what time are you going to be home?" And we'd say, "I don't know." "Why?" He's like, "What time do you think you should be home?" And we'd say, "Okay, 1." He's like, "All right, see you at 12:45 unless you use your cushion," which I think, we talked about on a time thing. But we'd always be like, "Shoot, I should have said 2," because he would let us set our curfew. He was brilliant that way. Yeah. The other thing he always did was, "I always want to say yes, always, because I love you and I want to give you what you want. But let's sit down and talk through why I might need to say no. Let's just
that's
look for any reason I might need to say no." And he was really calm about it. And the interesting thing is, we also grew up with a lot of fear, just because, like you wait till your father gets home kind of thing. Right. And so sometimes we shielded him from stuff that we probably didn't need to shield him from, like, "Oh, don't tell Dad that broke," or "Don't tell Dad this happened." And I learned that too late. I think too late. I realized the only thing that would just send him off is if he felt like we weren't being honest or giving him the full story. He could have handled anything. So, I look back and I think there's a lot of that I like to emulate.
It's
not
so
all
funny.
of it.
Yeah.
Some of it was scary.
I'm sure there's things we don't want to emulate on our moms, and our kids are going to do the same thing to us. It's so funny because I'm so aware of, and I say this just because it's so fascinating that your dad was a fighter pilot. That's unusual, right? And I never identify my dad really around his job, but he was a salesman. But he was very much sort of a Willy Loman. I mean, he was, and I say this, and maybe I'm not saying this correctly. I'm not deep into that play in particular, but like my dad was really more of a customer service person. If he had a client, he was going to service you from a client standpoint so well. Like he was in advertising specialties, essentially swag, and one of his big clients was Procter and Gamble, and they had him for years because he was so good at servicing the account. And so my dad would say to me over and over and over, you should be in sales. And I think like anything, I'd look at that and I'd say, yeah, I'm sure I would be great at sales, and I'm better at customer service. So I just like took what I saw him actually good at and thought, no, I'm not going to go down that path that you haven't really been that successful at. The other thing, I'll just throw this in because as you were talking, I thought, what's kind of an interesting thing about my dad? But I do actually have an interesting thing about my dad. He is in medical books because when he was in college, he had an acute case of appendicitis. And when they went in to take out his appendix, his intestines his entire life had been folded over on themselves. They didn't know. And so they opened him up and his intestines flopped over. And they literally wondered how he had ever survived because his intestines were on top of each other. It's crazy. And so, so that was, I didn't learn that until I was much older, but so he's actually in like kind of like a medical mystery sort of thing. Isn't that fascinating?
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And then he ended up getting a very rare autoimmune disease called Wegener's granulomatosis, which is it's super rare. So, it's
wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad he's okay. At some other point, if we ever talk about weird medical things again, my brother had a megacolon. So I wonder if they are similar. I don't know. Like that was a scary thing that happened.
Have to talk about that. Maybe not
somewhere else. Yeah. That's just so I've never heard of that folded over.
Yeah,
wow.
I know, it's crazy. Yeah.
My mom just like, we don't have callers in, although people have asked us, can I call in? But my mom just said James Joseph Napoleon Charles Louis Morin. So
okay, so
not Aloysius
was
in my
granddad.
Yeah. Anyway, funny. The other thing I forgot, I don't know, like there's no natural way to bring this up, but my dad's arms were in a movie as Charlton Heston's arms because he was playing a pilot, but they needed it to look real. So they hired my dad.
That's interesting. That's cool.
So when they went down to the arms, it was my dad's arms.
Okay, so I'll match that. My dad and I were in a local after school special where he was
very special episode.
It was a very special episode. He was the principal. And again, this comes from my mom worked for a modeling studio. So that's how we got this sort of in. But I was buzzed out because it was one about sexual abuse. So he was the principal talking to me about it, but you don't see me. You just like see my hands. But yeah, so there was my dad's acting debut.
That is so good. Well, we should pull up these clips.
I don't think
I don't know if I can either. What do you think you missed most? Let's talk about what we missed most.
So I say this to many people when I talk to them. My dad did actually pass. Well, I believe he passed from the Wegeners because he was diagnosed when Charlotte was, God, it was her first Halloween. I'll never forget the phone call. I answered the phone and I only knew it was him because I had caller ID. It didn't sound like him at all. He sounded horrible. And so, I mean, when he passed 4 years ago, so he had Wegeners for about 12, 13 years. And Wegeners, my understanding, and if there's people listening and you're like, this is completely wrong, my apologies, but my understanding of Wegeners is it's almost the opposite of scleroderma, like everything inside your body starts to disintegrate. And so like the first thing that disintegrated for him, and one of the first things that we realized was his eardrums, because he had hearing aids and he went in and like made a hole in his hearing, in his eardrum. So I believe that the dementia actually was probably a result of Wegener's. It had probably just finally gotten to the point where it was his brain. I
Mm.
was lucky enough that he never got to the point where he didn't know who we were. So that was good. He definitely had different times of like psychosis and things like that. But consequently, even though he's only been gone 4 years, I feel like he's been gone for at least 6 because it was the long goodbye. And, Dad and I, like my mom, although I think I said on the Mother's Day pod, Mom and I would talk every week for about 2 hours. Dad and I we were very short and sweet. So it was like 15-minute phone calls. What's going on? How's Liam? How's Charlotte? How's Darren? How's the job? How's your car? It was just very like a little role play. But it got to the point, pretty much when we moved out here and things started going downhill, where I couldn't even share things with him because he wouldn't have understood them and he wouldn't have remembered. So I do miss, I miss talking to him. I miss his support. I miss his excitement about everything. His grandkids, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but his grandkids were obviously all brilliant. And so I miss all of that. But I lost it over the course of, and that was the hardest part for anyone who's had a family member with dementia. It's so hard to see the physical person there and they're not really there anymore, and so
Yeah.
you can't have those same conversations. I miss his sense of humor for sure. I mean, he definitely had a very dry, ribald sense of humor. It's very similar to mine.
I
um,
bet.
that's so those kinds of things. I missed, but again, I've lost it way before he actually died for sure,
Mm.
which is,
Yeah, that missing, that grieving while they're
mhm.
still there.
Yeah,
It's not, my dad didn't have, official, like he didn't have Alzheimer's, but he had dementia brought on by meds, I believe.
sure. Yep.
My dad passed away 12 years ago. Oh, almost 13, or is it 12? Something like that. And that was 3 years after a double lung transplant. And leading up to that double lung transplant was idiopathic. I was about to say idiotic. It was idiotic. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. One of the things I didn't mention earlier, which is funny, like the thing about my dad, if you knew me, is disciplined. He apparently at some point, was a smoker and a drinker, and like he just like gave up the hard stuff and just went to beer and wine, and then like gave up smoking and cheese and all that. Like in one day, he was like, "Yep, I'm done with that." He just had this
When
ability.
he got that diagnosis?
No.
Before
This is
that,
like
even?
before I was born.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So my whole life, I never knew him as a smoker.
Mm.
And when he got his sister, who never had smoked, died from pulmonary fibrosis.
Ah,
So, and hers was idiopathic also. So when we asked, we're like, is this something to do with this in smoking? They're like, likely not. You'll see it in siblings. And he's now since had another sister who has passed away, and she had it,
wow.
the pulmonary stuff. So we think it's something they were exposed to as children, right? That makes more
Interesting.
sense. We're in a
Yeah.
pretty poor neighborhood in downtown Rochester, maybe the building, like asbestos or something. I don't know.
Sure.
But anyway, that was pretty scary, because if you know anything about it, there's not much you can do about it. So if you get a cold, it's a steep decline, and then you might plateau for a while. So we got really lucky that he got the lung transplant, but he was a little on the older end and had some heart history, especially his dad's, that made him a risk. And so he came out of that not quite himself. And that part was hard, because he was the sharpest person we ever knew. He was the sharpest, strongest person we ever knew. And my mom, God bless her, she could handle everything. But when he was not totally in his right mind, we wanted to be there to support her, because that's hard. Like you said, when the person you love is physically there. But he was sometimes, he was definitely in and out of lucidity. And it just, that was like, to not go into that too deeply, because of time, that journey was so humbling for us, because we as his kids were like, he always said he didn't want to be around for this. Why are we prolonging this? Like, we should get him comfortable. Like, we had all these opinions that we thought would be best for everyone, right? And they were like, screw you, we'll take one day together as long as we can. He was a really his strong faith, and he would say, if God wants to stop my heart, let him, don't do anything, but I'm not going to give up. And he was a Marine. Like, I'm not going to stop trying. I'm not leaving her. So in the end, it was just the most beautiful story of, I don't want to leave her. Right. And so he really fought hard till the end. And I guess that's just who he was. Right.
I mean, I will say, and I think my sister would agree with me. I am pretty sure that my dad continue to love my mom. And my mom was one of the last people to see him with me. She picked me up at the airport and took me to hospice with him and stayed there with me. But I remember our final sort of phone conversation, and Amy was in the room. I was on the phone, but Amy and my mom were there because, again, my mom was so generous to support my sister going through all this because they were close and I was here in LA. And I remember my mom saying that my dad was just like burrowing his eyes into her, like looking at her, but he really wasn't vocal at this point. But it was just this sense of him looking at her like, please forgive me,
Aw.
and so I really felt like there was a nice closure between the two of them at the end, which was good. Yeah.
I was gonna say too that what I missed most is like he's so wise. He was really funny, so wise. And he just had a way of, oh God, he had the warmest welcome. Like anyone who ever came in our house, he'd be like, Lisa, what are you drinking? Let me get you a glass of wine. He like big open arms, and like he'd answer the door like this. I mean, to my mom's credit, she was probably doing most of the stuff in the kitchen, but he was such a good host, like,
yeah,
so good. And really warm and really engaged with people. And I miss that around my kids. I miss that around my friends. I just love that he was just such a warm, wonderful, being.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Well, let's talk about the men we then married, because one, there is
our baby daddies.
Baby daddies. Yeah, I have all that too. But there is kind of a school of thought that you marry somebody similar, right? And I think I do see some similarities with Darren and my dad, but I also see a big difference. And for me, the big difference is Darren is so prolific and is so such a I would almost say a workaholic. And he used to say about my dad, like, I don't really understand your dad because he seems so happy with just nothing, which is true. I mean, and I say that meaning he died with no debt. He lived in an apartment. He didn't have a lot of belongings. I mean, we literally cleaned out his nursing home room in like an hour. Like he just was not, he just didn't have a lot of stuff around him. And he just was happy with his very simple life. The fact that he never dated or got remarried. And so that was always a little confusing to Darren because he's so he's such a generator of stuff, of art and creating and all that stuff. And so but his sense of humor, his very dry sense of humor is very my dad.
I love
can I tell one more funny story about Darren and Dad, and then we'll move on to, okay. So here's my funniest story. And anybody that knows me knows this story. So Darren and I were friends going in our senior year in high school. But we knew we were going to the same college. So we went to tour it. And my dad took both of us. And we're touring around the school, and Darren goes to walk up the stairs and trips up the stairs. And my dad, because of who he was like, oh my God, who is this guy? Then Darren goes to get a drink of water out of the water fountain. And it's one of those that spurts up his nose. And I thought my dad was going to pee his pants. That ended up in our wedding toast, because my dad was just like, oh my God, who is this guy my daughter is hanging around?
That is awesome. And obviously he won him over.
Yes.
My impressions of Darren, even before I ever met you and him in person, because, as our listeners probably know, Lisa and I work for a remote, like we work from home. And so we knew each other before we actually were together.
Yes.
So just watching, like the stuff you would share, he just always has this great smirk, and like he's so amused by you and his kids, and he's like got a funny thought he might share, he might not. He's got like a very witty take on everything, and I think it has totally translated to your kids in wonderful ways. I think he holds a lot of space without taking up too much. Some people, like especially a parent, sometimes can take up all the space in the room, and he holds his own space really well, and he like makes room for others. And just like being down there most recently and watching Charlotte and is it Angie?
Yes. Yeah.
Play guitar, and just like the love and the pride and the actual just appreciation of her art.
Yeah.
is so beautiful. Like, so I love like those sides of him. I just feel like that's coming very naturally. That's my take on it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Darren's dad died when he was in the 6th grade. So beyond the 6th grade, Darren doesn't really have a role model of how to parent, but I do think his dad was kind of funny and artistic, and he was a newspaper man and in the CIA. And so I do think there's a lot that, even though Darren had a very short time with his own dad, I do think he gleaned a lot of that for sure. Yes, Darren is a very good partner as a father, for sure. We are on the same page a lot. And when we're not, we pretend like we are and then talk about it opposite. We mentioned this in another pod too. Like, to me, it's very important that parents show a united front. And if there is some discussion to be had, you have it behind the scenes, and maybe you go back and rediscuss it with your children. But there's never this, it's not that the kids, Charlotte in particular, that doesn't do the go talk to dad and then go talk to mom. Well, dad said I could do it. I mean, she definitely does that. But, for the most part, he is a very good co-parent, no question. And he is super supportive of the kids and their art and all that. I mean, yes, I have an artistic bent and I'm a creator for sure, but their love, their ability to play music and to be writers and directors and all of that sort of thing definitely come from him for sure.
That's awesome.
What about Brendan?
Yeah, it's funny, when I was saying my dad was a fighter pilot, Brendan and his two brothers, he's like, Brendan's the second oldest of five, and Brendan and his two brothers were fascinated that my dad, when we were all in high school, that he was a fighter pilot, and they wanted to come around and like talk to him.
Top Gun.
They'd see, yeah, he flew at Top Gun. He was he flew at Miramar. So they want to come talk to him about that, right? Because they were both military bound. He wasn't. He was like, I was coming around to see you. But my dad just was so impressed with the Carol boys. And Julie and I, up until that point, we were like, going to air shows. And now I look back, like, he knew all the Blue Angels. That is so cool. And we did not appreciate it enough at the time. And so he always liked the Carol boys. He liked how they, showed up in the world. So we dated in high school, lost touch. And then when we were gonna, when we started to like maybe connect again later after college, we lived in DC. A story for another time is he kind of blew it with me when I was just like trying to connect as friends, and it's kind of a funny story. But later he was trying to reach me, and my dad was like, just would, like try to get me on the phone. I mean, there was no cell phones, right? So he'd wait to like call home, and he'd be like, Brendan Carroll has called here. Do you have his number? And then he'd like, it was just so funny because my dad never really tried hard at anything. He was really cool, but he just really wanted to make sure we reconnected. So he definitely left it. We joke sometimes that like he would keep him over me if we split up. It's like, he really, really likes Brendan, loves Brendan, and Brendan loves him. Brendan lost his dad when he was 20, and he has a wonderful stepdad, and also felt like my dad was a dad for him. They were really close, really appreciated each other a lot.
That must have been tough for Brendan then, when your dad died on top of his dad already passing.
Yes.
How was that for him?
It was hard. It was definitely hard. I mean, one of the things that he, and then Peter, our oldest, even said last summer, so dad lost his dad when he was 20, and what he felt like he missed out on, because Brendan's dad was just like the funniest person. He was Navy, he's really smart, super like, and I got to know him in high school, luckily, because Brendan got in a little trouble and was grounded. So I hung out there.
And a story for another time.
Yes, but he, such a funny guy, and talk about someone who holds court. And I guess I kind of sat in the hot seat whenever I'd sit next to him, and he would give me a lot of shit and I would give it right back, and they'd be like, oh, he liked that a lot. So even when we were broken up and not in touch for years, they would say like, oh, he'd ask about you, which is nice. But for Brendan, he'd say to our kids, like, I was just looking forward to the time where we got to just be guys, like, because he was a dad, and then he was gone. And last summer, Peter was like, I'm 20 and I haven't lost my dad. And I know we're all so busy, but I just want time with him. And it was just such a wonderful invitation to Brendan. Brendan was so warmed by that. And they did. Brendan went out there and they had a great time. I would say he's nothing like my dad, though. It's interesting. One of the gifts I got from Brendan early on, before we even had kids, was this idea that why does it have to be someone's fault? I don't know why. In my family, there was a lot of binary. Who did this? Whose fault is it?
Mm.
Say sorry, let's move on. Like, there's a lot of just typical Catholic guilt, but there was a lot of solving on like, was this your fault?
Right,
And
right, right.
it wasn't good or bad. It just was what it was. But he'd say, why does it have to be someone's fault? And it really, like, he really kind of removed, or he'd say, why I feel guilty? Like, either say
Mm.
sorry or don't do it. Like, he just always had a different approach to things that softened the way I, was thinking things had to be. And then I think for him, Brendan's parents never fought in front of them, and my parents definitely did, but they also showed us how to repair. So I
Mhm.
think like that's how we kind of, so my dad has all that passion, and I think that's what Brendan really likes in me. And then also, like, Brendan has a lot more of my mom's. My dad used to say, I made them responsible, she made them nice. And I would
Oh,
say Brendan probably makes them nice. I make them thoughtful, like I create like the fun stuff, like, the passion part. And he's just this really, really when I say kind soul, I'm leaving out that he also has a sick, dark sense of humor, too. But he's
good. That's the best kind.
very methodical. Like yesterday, something kind of stupid went down with the boys, and the way they handled a car breaking down, and he just kind of took it. He listened first, and that wouldn't have been my first response, So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the way we balance each other. That
Yeah.
said, it's interesting. They come to me first. They're sometimes afraid to tell him stuff, and I think, why? He's so much nicer than me. I don't get it.
I know,
Um,
me too. But I think that speaks to like kids wanting boundaries. Again, a whole nother
yeah,
topic. But that's exactly right. Darren's the nice, calm, cool, collected. I'm the
yep.
hothead. But I have been absolutely told, like, well, I'm gonna come to you and tell,
Yeah, it's so interesting. And so
Yeah.
like I feel like he has that backbone. And Brendan's in healthcare, and God bless everyone in healthcare right now.
Oh my gosh.
He's so much busier than he wants to be, and busier than they want him
Yeah.
to be. And they really appreciate it. And when he's here, he is full on, and he
Nice.
bonds over sports. He bonds over music, that he's a musician. He's always had just a total breadth of knowledge. He finds all of these, indie artists all the time and puts together playlists. Since they were little, he'd always make them a birthday playlist. So he's introduced them to music since they were born. Sports they really get into, they follow sports together. He was always into, and one of the things they know is like, they know that Brendan will prioritize spending on gear, because if
Oh,
he's into
nice.
something, he will. So like, he knows you're into something, he'll get you the gear. So
That's
that's
cool.
that's sort of an in where I'm like, you don't need that. You're probably going to do that once. That's my German grandmother and me. He'll be like, I just wanted him to have the bindings for his skis, like, so
That's cute.
he kind of geeks out on that stuff.
I
But
love that.
and he has the total dad humor, like to the point where he even rolls his eyes before it comes out, and we're like, don't say it, don't say it.
I
So
can see
like,
the eye roll. Don't say
he's
it.
like super funny, but then he also has the dad humor. And notice how
Mhm.
I'm separating those.
Mhm. Yes.
So
I am
yeah,
noticing that.
yeah.
I am not lucky in that I haven't met Brendan. I
I
mean,
know, I
I
know.
mean, because our time together has either been together with our work stuff, or you have come down here to LA from Portland. And so I do look forward to coming up there and spending time with and getting to know him. I mean, literally, I think the only interaction I've had with him is when we did our cheers at the launch of the pod. But I know him through you, and I think I mean, the bottom line is you can't have three boys that are as amazing as they are without a really nice influence on both from their mom and their dad, right? So I think my awareness and my thoughts on Brendan are reflected back in what I see in the boys and your guys' relationship. And yeah, I mean, he works hard, and he also is available when he's home. And I think that's, I don't know that
Mhm,
that's normal with somebody who works really hard. I know many
mhm.
humans, and I'm not going to say men, because I think women do this too, who they come home and they need to isolate. They need to have their own like energy refill. And I don't feel like Brendan does that. Like as you
Mhm.
said, when he's home and he's
Yeah,
present. And that's really great.
yeah, yeah. That's so sweet.
Yeah.
I did pull a quote because I like to do that, and sometimes when there's one appropriate, and I did find one, and I'm going to butcher the name, Emil Gaboriau. Sorry, it's a lot of vowels in that name. Gaborio. I don't know.
We'll throw it up as
A father is the one friend upon whom we can always rely, and I love that. I do. I do
yeah.
miss that. I miss
Yeah.
that.
It's
That type of friend.
Yes, for sure. I agree. And that makes me ask one final question around them before we move into
Mhm.
our dads as granddads, because Liam has made note of the fact that since he has moved, when he gets home, when he comes home, or like we happen to be leaving to go down there this weekend, he's like, man, dad seems really happy to see me. Not that he
Oh,
wasn't, but I think the distance, Liam not being here, and I do notice it too. Like Darren gets extra goofy when Liam's around, like almost annoying to me. Sorry, Darren, I know you're listening. But just like it's funny, it's almost like he reverts back to Liam being little because he gets kind of goofy and wanting to play and Russell and Liam's just like, what the hell is happening? So do you notice
that's
that
pretty
with
adorable.
I mean, Peter's home right now. So have you noticed that at all? Like, is there a shift in you already mentioned what Peter said last summer, but what are you noticing about with Peter gone and when he comes
Mm,
home?
I think he misses them a lot. I
Yeah.
think the first year he was gone, he had to notice like I got to stop being so transactional. Like
Nice.
I think at a certain point your kids grow up and you forget like it doesn't have to always be don't forget this and this. Like, hey, what are you
Right.
up to? And share something about yourself. So I think his response to that desire to and remember his own 20-year-old wishes
Yeah.
has made it just nice for him to play guitar or listen to Peter play guitar because he's so good.
Mm.
And that just blew Brendan away that Brendan was self-taught and he really worked hard to get good at certain songs and Peter kind of picked them up really quick. He was like, dang. But he also loves that. So like
Yeah.
he misses him. He's giddy to have him around. They just went and played golf together today, and there was no time for that, but they made that happen. So I think I help with that, but I think like that's something that means a lot to both of them.
Yeah. That's awesome. And obviously, for those who haven't figured this out, we're recording this way before Father's Day. So this is happening
Yes,
pre
that's right.
Father's
But
Day.
yeah, and Peter won't be around for that. So yeah,
No, no. Mm.
yeah.
So your dad is a granddad. We were talking about this before we started, and you were like, "Oh my God, he was totally different." So do tell.
Oh, it's just funny because my mom was like born to be a grandmother, and he was like, ugh,
Oh,
like I feel so young. Well, don't call me Papa. But then, oh my gosh, when it happened, he just embraced the heck out of it. He was still flying when he had his first like 3 or 4 grandchildren. So I have
mm.
pictures of him with my niece, like just off of a flight, like in his pilot, her just putting her head on his shoulder, and
Oh.
it sort of melted. He was so tough, like with us, like, grit your teeth, don't cry. And then he was just, as we got older, he would get so sappy and cry when he saw us. And then just being a
Mm.
granddad, he was very playful. He expected respect and good behavior. He didn't want to see our kids disrespect us either.
Right. Right.
And he
Right.
and he was outspoken about that. I mean, and he just had this passionate connection with them. He called Peter the Great or Isabella Mia, or Sophia's going to be a CEO. Like he just kind of connected with them all and loved their little personalities. High five, Brad. And so even when he was, I mean, Miles really only remembers him sick, and that used to bum him out. It's like he's not
Mm.
going to remember, like he was throwing the ball for Peter, playing trains or planes,
Right.
and he was worried about that because he was on oxygen, and sometimes he was even in like the little motor scooter thing.
Yeah.
Miles just, and even the older kids at first would just be like, "Oh, Papa," and Miles would just run right up and get on his lap and just like high five him. And I have really precious pictures from those last years. And I actually did a thing when we were all on a trip to Alaska together, and we could see that the decline was happening faster, and
Mm.
we didn't even want them to travel all the way back home. They were going to drive down, and so Brennan went with them, and the boys and I think, flew down or drove down. Maybe we drove down separately because he went in their car. And I just decided to camp out and videotape him and ask a bunch of questions from his grandchildren. And so I'm so grateful I have that
Oh,
because it was
that's
just
amazing.
brilliant. And this was before his transplant. So he was really sharp. And so yeah, he was dear. He was really, really dear. He thought they were brilliant.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I think it was really important to him that he leave a legacy. Like he was really
Mm.
generous and, put together accounts for them. And I think that's what I miss too, is that my boys don't have that kind of role model around.
Yeah. No, that's great.
How about your dad?
Yeah, I mean, I think dad was a pretty similar dad and granddad. Again, I said, like all the kids were brilliant. Liam was his only grandson. And so my curiosity that will never be satiated is what he would think of his granddaughters now, because Liam is incredibly smart, but so are all three of his granddaughters. And I remember thinking he'd always be like, you should get him tested. I bet he's a genius. It's always that. And the funny thing is, from a school perspective, Charlotte is actually way smarter than Liam, but he didn't see that in the girls, right? Because again, just generational. So it would be curious. I wish I knew what he would think of them and my two nieces now,
Totally.
Luckily, I think all of them have, as I said, he only passed 4 years ago. So Charlotte and Olivia were 13, so Mia was 11. So they all have a good, solid memory. In retrospect, my last day physically with my dad when he wasn't in hospice, I was with him and we FaceTime. We FaceTimed with Liam and Charlotte. And we joked afterwards, Liam and I, that Grandpa ran through all of his greatest hits. Like if he farted, he always was stepping on it. Somebody stepped on a duck. There was no fart. Somebody stepped on a duck. So he definitely had the dad jokes. And I know now what I didn't know then, which was he was really good with them on the FaceTime. And so I walked away from that FaceTime going, okay, this is October, early October. So it's like, we'll see him at Christmas. And no, that was him saying goodbye, because he passed like 2 weeks later, but he did rally enough to be able to have that one final conversation with both of them. And then shortly after he passed, Liam was in a Habit hamburger place, which, normally just plays regular, pop music or whatever. And Help Me Rhonda by the Beach Boys came on.
Oh my gosh.
No reason. I have no reason for that to play. And that was my dad's favorite Beach Boys song. And so I remember Liam coming home and he was like, Grandpa was at Habit. He was there because Help Me Rhonda came on. And then it went back to like normal music. And I was like, oh, I love that so much.
I really love that about music.
Yeah.
You say Help Me Rhonda and I want to like dance to it, because we used to make up routines for our parents to Beach Boys. That's funny.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. We were going to talk about, and maybe we'll do this on one of the lives, but just like the idea, did your dad cuss much? Because mine, I remember it only once and it was a big deal. He was pissed.
No, my parents, it's interesting. My parents did not cuss when I was growing up, neither of them, but they did as they got older. And I think it was probably when we did. They never though, and my kids cussed and I cussed, clearly. I don't think that's news to anybody that's listening to the pod. But they never gave us shit about it, no pun intended. I think, and Darren's been the one that was, as a writer, it's like, it's just language, it's just words, you get to make meaning of it. And I feel like unknowingly, that's sort of the way my parents were too. Funny. But because they didn't cuss growing up, when their little old person mouth said fucking shit, it was still shocking, because I was like, what is happening?
It's like when the Irish people say "fulkin." Yeah.
Fulkin.
That's awesome. No, I think my dad may have sworn. Oh wait, but there's the very funny story that he always thought that you shouldn't swear in front of women, very old fashioned. And so at some point, some woman cut he and my mom and my aunt off in the car, and he wanted to cuss, and he went like this, he ripped off his glasses, and he goes, "You foolish woman, you!" And they just died laughing. They're like, "Well, you told her," but like, he wanted to say something else. But no, one time. Yeah, just one time. And Brendan is really good and well-timed with it, but definitely I cuss more than both of those men.
Yeah, I definitely have a sailor's mouth.
And
songs. I love it.
It's time for songs. All right. Oh, did you just go mute?
I did. Sorry, I'm unmuted now. I just had my phone in front of me. I immediately thought I knew exactly what song I wanted to put in for my dad. As I said in the music thing, my dad was much more like, I would have absolutely put the Stones next to my dad, even though I don't think he ever saw them live, but that's like my earliest memories of loving the Rolling Stones, and my mom was the Beatles. And so this song, it may not be his favorite Stones song, but we would say it all the time to each other, which is, you can't always get what you want. So it's pretty simple to recite, but I still had to pull it up. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. but he'd always go, but sometimes if you try sometimes, you get what you need, which is so true. I mean, that song is so spot on. And I love that idea of allowing, that's really what that's all about, which is definitely a place I live. And I suppose if I really thought about it, that's probably where my dad was too. Like, he took really good care of himself when he had Wagoners. He was bound and determined. You had to take care of it with like low doses of chemo. And go to the doctor on a regular basis and get checked. And he was just but he also just allowed that, he didn't fight anything. He wasn't angry about it, so there was a big sense of allowing. So I suppose that song fits for him.
That's beautiful. I love that. Mine isn't so much a fit. It's hard to not, like, whenever any of his 12 grandchildren hear the song, they think of him, which is Sweet Caroline. He just used to put his arms up and dance to it like this. And
who doesn't?
Right? It's just, he was like, I remember 45s of, Cracklin' Rosie or, Sweet Caroline, like all the Neil Diamond songs. And they even went and saw him in concert. So, yeah, I mean, when I hurt and runs off my shoulders, how can I hurt when holding you? Like, he would sing it with such passion. So that's mine.
And I love that because he had 3 daughters, right? And 1 son. And to me, I mean, my understanding of that song is Neil Diamond wrote it about Caroline Kennedy.
Yes.
Is what I've heard, right? So it really is a love song. What did you and your dad dance to at your wedding?
We danced. Well, that was the other thing I was going to also, is What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. Oh my gosh. How did we not know that before now?
That's we always learn something on this podcast.
That could have been our one song.
Damn it. I know, but I love the Rolling Stones song.
Me too. And I love the Neil Diamond.
We will throw that on as a bonus song on the Spotify playlist. So you'll get 3 songs for this week. Oh, I love that. That's what he danced to.
Me too. That's really sweet. We're having a moment.
We are having a moment. If you're watching the YouTube, you will see that we're having a moment.
Aw, well, this was fun. I feel like we could go on and on about dads and fathers, and grateful for all the people who take on that role in the ways and support the women that are the mothers in those situations. And we know most of our listeners are women, but for any men that are listening, we wish you a happy Father's Day. And to all the men you love who take on the dad role, whether it's to, children or their nieces and nephews or their fur babies, wishing them a happy Father's Day as well.
Yeah. And I think we have a fair amount of men that listen, but absolutely, to our own dad's memory, our partners, and, our kids who may someday be fathers as well. We're so grateful for the legacy that our fathers gave us, and our partners are giving our kids, all the laughters and the lessons and the support. And as we said very early on, parenting is not for wimps. So we are so glad that you are in our life and walking side by side with us as we navigate this amazing world that is parenting.
I know, you're right. We do have men who listen, our sons and our husbands. So happy Father's Day to our wonderful husbands.
There's at least like 7.
Yes. We hope you've enjoyed this bonus episode, and we can't wait to be back. We'll be back really soon because we drop on Tuesdays. So thank you for listening.
And if you liked today's episode, and maybe you do have a man in your life that you'd like to hear this, and along with it, tell them what you love about their space in your children's life. Again, whether it's a father or an uncle or a friend or whatever, please forward this on to them and let them know that you are thinking about them. And we'll see you back here on Tuesday.
So long.
Thanks, everyone.